Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm Peter Beinart, a fellow at the Foundation. Today is January 20th, 2025. I'm glad to be here with Katherine Franke. For the past 25 years, Katherine was on the faculty at Columbia University's Law School, where she served as director of the Center for Gender and Sexuality Law, on the executive committees of Columbia's Institute for the Study of Sexuality and Gender and the Center for Palestine Studies. She is among the nation's leading scholars writing on law, sexuality, race, and religion, drawing from feminist, queer, and critical race theory. Katherine, thanks so much for doing this.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's good to see you, Peter.
Good to see you. So for people who have not been following the controversy about your departure from Columbia, maybe you can just set the stage. What is it that people should know about the reasons that you, after 25 years, are no longer going to be on the Columbia Law School faculty?
Well, the environment at Columbia had become so toxic, not just for me, and I must say the students have borne it worse than I have, but the environment has become so toxic for those of us who have dared to question what is going on, between Israel and Palestine, and to ask for a ceasefire. We have one now. Let's hope it holds. To utter the word genocide, and to seek divestment of the university from countries that are participating in some way in a genocide or in really gross violations of international law. For all of us who are peacefully protesting on this campus, it's no longer a safe space. And I mean physically safe. I've been stalked by my own colleagues in the law school, law professors, who have followed me across the campus, screaming horrible things at me. I have people posing as students, coming to my office hours and surreptitiously videotaping me, and then those videos are edited in unflattering ways and posted on right-wing Twitter sites. I have students showing up in my classes as plants who are trying to provoke me and other people in the classroom into making comments they can then record and then use in social media. And then other faculty recording me without my permission. I've tried to work this out with the university to say this is not a safe space for me, but not only for me, for others, for students as well. And they were unresponsive. And instead, what they did is file charges against me when I defended our students who were peacefully protesting and were sprayed with a noxious thing that put some of them in the hospital. And I just felt like enough is enough. I actually cannot be part of the Columbia community safely anymore, and that many of the actions that my colleagues have taken, the university will not protect us from. And it's time I stopped teaching.
Did all of this start after October 7th and Israel's assault on Gaza? Or are you talking about also events that actually started before?
No, it all started after October 7th. You know, I was an undergraduate at Barnard in the late 70s and early 80s. And like most or many undergraduates, I was involved with all sorts of student protests around divestment from South Africa, the US involvement in Central America, Take Back the Night, you know, sexual violence, anti-rape stuff, a whole range of things, which was normal doings for students. I'm sure, Peter, you too were involved in student protests when you were in college. And then later I returned to the campus as a professor 25 years ago and have worked with students in that time while I was a professor as they were protesting all sorts of things, from divestment from fossil fuels to climate change to things the university was doing in the community that was racist or had an impact on other members of the Harlem community, all sorts of things. And the university tolerated, if not welcomed, student protests. There, you know, the students put a shanty town up on the steps of Butler Library, and Low Library also, both facing one another, during the divestment efforts, and the university let it sit there. And in fact, Ed Koch came over, the mayor of the city of New York, and took part in that shanty town to protest what was going, apartheid in South Africa. But it was something very different started happening after October 7th. Of course, so many members of our Columbia community were impacted directly by the horrible attacks on October 7th. There were many, many members of the community who knew people who were kidnapped or killed. And then, of course, in the aftermath that followed, many other people who were impacted by the attacks in Gaza. And so many of us had a very personal stake in what was going on in Israel and in Palestine. And I think that changed some of how we all responded to it. But what really changed was how the university immediately clamped down on any peaceful protest. And surrendered to what were external pressures, I think, from outside the university, to treat any pro-Palestinian protest, any expression of speech in favor of the rights and dignity of Palestinians as a form of anti-Semitism. And it's that collapse of defending Palestinian dignity with anti-Semitism that I think has been the framing device on our campus, and in my view, is a form of anti-Palestinian racism.
And yet I suppose there are folks who would say, what do you mean that Columbia didn't tolerate any pro-Palestinian protests, that there were protests for a long period of time, student protests of all sorts, culminating in an encampment, which obviously was eventually broken up, but lasted for a significant period of time. So when you say that there was no tolerance for pro-Palestinian protests, explain a little more what you mean by that.
Well, the students yes, they were protesting, and then they were prosecuted for disciplinary violations for doing so.
Mhm.
Up to the point where the university called the police and
Mhm.
had them arrested
Mhm.
several times. So that doesn't count to me as a form of tolerance.
Mhm.
What the university did really starting in early November is create new disciplinary rules around protests without publishing them, without notifying the students, and just in the dark of night, publish them in some cases on websites that students didn't have access to, and then brought charges against them that they were violating the rules around protest. There were these new, very restrictive rules that were nothing like we'd ever seen before. And then SJP and JVP were suspended for
Students for
violating
Justice in
those
Palestine
rules.
and Jewish Force for Peace. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, yes, these two groups that are supportive of a certain vision of peace in the Middle East. And that's really when things started to shift, is that the university took an extremely retributive and regulatory posture with regard to the students. And to be honest, my feeling was just let them protest. They probably would have, a lot of it would have run its course.
Mhm.
But because the university behaved so aggressively with the students, Columbia then became the subject of their protests.
Mhm. Mhm.
In addition to obviously what was going on in Gaza. And so what at every moment where the university could have de-escalated the situation, they escalated it. And so of course the students met that. And then there was another escalation from the university, and then the students followed suit. And it was extremely frustrating for those of us who were trying to de-escalate these situations, find a way to sit down and talk. That we did not have what I thought was a good faith partner on the part of the university.
What do you think, what restrictions on protests, if any, do you think are legitimate for a university? I imagine that the university would say, might say things along the lines of, well, if we want to hold graduation here on the front lawn, but we've got a big encampment in the middle of it, that's going to actually cause problems for people who want to go see their kids graduate, or if students are, I mean, maybe this didn't happen at Columbia, but at some other universities, you heard things about students being blocked from getting to their classes, or classes disrupted by protests. What do you think is the right way to think about what right a university has to limit or restrict protest that doesn't cross the line into violations of free speech?
Well, we have a concept within the free speech law itself, constitutional law, of time, place, and manner restrictions. Is
Mhm.
that whether it's the university or the city of New York, they can say, look, but broadly, we will allow all manner of demonstrations up to the point of violence. And again, I want to underscore that the students have not been violent
Mhm.
in any of these protests. And to the extent that there's accusations that they were, almost universally, those were by outsiders. They were not people who were part of the Columbia community.
Accusations of violence by pro-Palestinian protesters who were not
Yes.
Columbia.
They were not Columbia affiliates, and there
Mhm.
were very, very few instances of any kind of actual violence that I'm aware of, let alone ugly words. But those were not our students. Those were other people on campus. But back to this idea of time, place, and manner, if students are protesting in a way that disrupts classes, disrupts people's ability to cross the campus, to, move about the campus, right? That's not legitimate. They should be able to protest in ways that allow the university to continue to function. And if they do things, in my view, that disable the regular functioning of the university, it's legitimate to bring disciplinary charges against them. But the level of discipline that has been meted out is so disproportionate in almost every one of the cases that I've seen, to what the students actually did. There was a protest of a conference that Hillary Clinton was holding at the School of International Affairs last year, where the students did a silent protest. They went to this talk that Secretary Clinton was giving, and at some point they stood up and walked out. That would not have normally counted as a disciplinary violation because they were being quiet. And in fact, I represented two students who were brought up on charges who had gotten up and left because one of them was having an asthma attack and she couldn't breathe, and her inhalator was in the bag she had to check at the door. They prosecuted her and her friend and disciplined them for getting up and leaving an event when they had a medical reason for doing so, not a political reason for doing so. But we would have never seen these kinds of disciplinary charges and sanctions in the pre-October 7th period. So, if they'd gotten up and made it so that the event couldn't happen at all right, I can see it would be legitimate to maybe bring some charges there, but then not to sanction them so aggressively as they have.
Now, as I understand it, the disciplinary complaint that was brought against you had to do with comments that you made on Democracy Now!, talking about the role of students who had formerly served in the Israeli military. I wonder if you can just talk about what you said in that interview, and then the claim that was the complaint that was made, and what followed from that.
So there was a protest in January. The students were on the campus calling for a ceasefire and divestment. It was peaceful. And the protest was infiltrated by three other students who were really counter protesters who sprayed the students with some noxious element. I don't know what it was. And the stuff that they sprayed them with was so intense that several of students had very serious upper respiratory problems and had to be hospitalized. Others had throat issues and things like that. So Democracy Now! Invited me to come on the show to talk about it. And it had turned out that the three students who had sprayed the protesters were part of a joint degree program that we have at Columbia with Tel Aviv University, where you can come and get a joint degree from Columbia and Tel Aviv University. And it's almost all older students who are part of that program, that joint degree program. And as is very often the case, the students who are coming from Israel to Columbia have just completed their military service. Which is, as you know, mandatory for many Israelis, not all. There are certain that are exempted. And so these three had been identified by the students as as Israeli, and who had just completed their service because they proudly said they had in Facebook posts and in their discussions in classes. And so they were known to the students. So I went on the show and I recounted the facts I just recounted to you. And I said that I have seen a pattern of Israeli students on our campus who have just finished their military service, harassing both verbally and physically Palestinian students and other allies of the Palestinian students. And I knew this because for years, the students had come to my office and said, we had set up this demonstration, we had set up this poster thing, whatever, in favor of Palestinian rights. And these other students had come over, and at some point, some of them, they had actually grabbed the pro-Palestinian students, and others, they spit on them. Sometimes they would yell horrible things to them. And so I saw this as a pattern, and we had complained to the university and said, we need to do a better job of integrating these students into the Columbia's culture. Maybe it's the case that coming right out of your military service with the state of mind one needs to be a soldier is different from the state of mind you need to be a student, where you're in close proximity to people who you've just been taught were the enemy. And the university had not done anything about it. And so this spring, last January, I saw as part of that pattern of bringing students onto our campus who brought with them a military state of mind that they'd been trained to have in the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. And it's those comments that two of my colleagues in the law school filed a complaint about, that they felt that what I was saying stereotyped Israelis, all Israelis, and created a hostile environment for Israelis on our campus. So,
Is there any document? I mean, beyond you mentioned stories that you had heard from pro-Palestinian protesters. Has there been any documented evidence of a pattern by former Israeli soldiers who are on the Columbia campus of harassment or other, antisocial or violent behavior in general, or was it just anecdotal, things that you had heard from people?
well, it wasn't anecdotal. There were stories in the newspaper about it. I mean, students talked about it at the time.
Mm-hmm.
The Columbia Spectator, which is the Columbia newspaper, had written about it, several of these incidents.
Mm-hmm.
I believe, I don't know for sure, but I believe that students actually filed complaints with public safety.
Mm-hmm.
There was a bomb threat from at one protest that they were having, and I know they filed a concern with public safety, and the university didn't respond. So when you say documented evidence, I guess if we could find all those complaints that were filed, but certainly there were media reports about it. And in support of my appeal from the finding that I had violated Columbia's rules, I submitted a bunch of letters from former students who had said, yes, these events had happened, and we had spoken to Professor Franke about it. And yes, she was aware that there had been this kind of problem over time.
And was the position that you were suggesting in that interview, or that you hold, that students who served in the IDF should not be admitted to Columbia, or simply that there should be some transitional mechanism for them?
There should be a better transitional mechanism for them. We have a lot of Israeli students in the law school, and I've had many of them in my classes. I've supervised the PhDs. The dissertations of several Israeli students, all of whom have served in the IDF. So not every one of the people who has performed military service has a problem with that transition, but some do. Some do. And we do have an office that addresses the incorporation of veterans into the academic community. And my feeling was that that office needed to do a better job with folks, with some people for whom this might have been a difficult transition. And there's actually quite a lot of academic and scientific research on the problem of, or the possible problem of integrating some recent vets into an academic context from all sorts of things having to do with PTSD and just the discharge from the Army itself or the military itself. But I think there's a particular issue with having IDF soldiers or prior IDF soldiers in an environment where we are actively critiquing the very war or the very military campaigns that they were just part of. And I mean, it's foreseeable that that would be quite difficult, I think, for some people. But the university does nothing to address that.
So are you suggesting a broader program for military veterans in general, or something specifically for people who served in the IDF?
In general.
Hmm. Hmm.
In general, but I think we would have to imagine as a security issue for all members of the campus that when you have just come out of active service in such a difficult place like Israel and Palestine, to then be on our campus where the majority of students are protesting against the very military that you were just part of, that would be difficult. So I do think there's something particular about Israeli veterans that we could foresee when this issue is on our campus and alive on our campus as it has been, whether it was through cast lead and prior attacks by the Israeli military in Gaza, or what's happening right now or has been happening since October 7th.
And what did you imagine I mean, these are students who, probably have fairly many of them strong views about this subject. What would have been the kind of the curricula or the effort that you imagined the office taking vis-a-vis those soldiers?
Peter, I don't know. That's not my expertise. There are people who know how to do this. And we probably have them on our faculty. But that's not my expertise. What concerned me is that no one was doing it. We merely expanded a graduate program to bring into our campus a group of people who hold a military, some of them do, a militarily indoctrinated view that certain others are enemies, and then they are close to those people on our campus. And would I say that's true for every Israeli person? Of course not. But it's foreseeable that it would be true for some.
So these two of your colleagues brought a complaint with the Office of Equal Employment and Affirmative Action. And then what happened then?
Well, an investigation begins. In this case, I didn't think there would be much of an investigation. You can read watch the interview and make a judgment. Was it discriminatory or not? But the process dragged on for a while and then became politicized. And it was at the very point when Republican members of Congress, some of them, were seeking to politicize the issues of student protests on campus. And Columbia was one of the schools that was identified as a target. And our then president of the university went and testified before Congress. And my comments came up, as well as comments by several other faculty. What I said was misquoted by Representative Stefanik, grossly misquoted. And President Shafiq, then the president of Columbia, said, yes, I agree, those comments are discriminatory. She will be disciplined, or she will be dealt with. I had already told President Shafiq that I did not say those things, that this was circulating in right-wing circles, referred her to the actual interview and the quotes of what I did say and explained why I said it. She did not disavow what Representative Stefanik said, and instead ratified what I think is a defamatory statement. So at that point,
Sorry, just because I think it's worth clarifying. What I think Elise Stefanik said that you had said that, quote, all Israeli students who have served in the IDF are dangerous and shouldn't be on campus. I think you already implied this a little bit as much. Maybe just it's worth saying just explicitly why that was incorrect.
I have never said that all Israeli students are dangerous. I don't believe that. I know many Israeli people. Not all Israeli people or students are dangerous. And I don't think that all Israeli people should be banned from our campus. And indeed, I don't think all people who've just served in the IDF should be banned from our campus. I think our campus has to better deal with what it means to integrate people into the academic setting who are just coming out of their military service, in particular when there is active protesting and student engagement with the very war that you were just part of. So that's all I said, that's all I meant. But I would never have claimed that all Israelis are dangerous. I would never generalize about any group of people that way. And it's because it's immoral and it's not what I believe. But those comments, well, go ahead, Peter.
No, please go ahead.
So those comments by the president of the university led me to believe and to conclude that there was no way the university could undertake an independent investigation of this issue. And so my lawyer and I demanded that that the university appoint an outside neutral investigator. And the university said no, and we said, please do it. And they said no, and it went on around for a while, and then finally they did. And then it took some time for the real investigation to take place, and I was interviewed 3 times. And at one point, the journalist called me over the summer who who knew about this and asked me to confirm the names of the complainants, which are in the complaint, and so I did. I didn't have any thought that this was confidential. There's no confidentiality language in the rules themselves. And those complainants filed a second complaint against me for having confirmed their names to a journalist. And so this proceeded until November, the day before Thanksgiving. I got a ruling finding that I had violated the rules by making those comments on Democracy Now! And that I had retaliated against the complainants for confirming their names, even though I fully believe they were public record and already out there. So that's sort of where things ended in terms of that investigation.
Right. And was it at that point that you made the decision? Help us go from that moment until the moment where to January 10th, 2025, where you make a statement announcing your departure from Columbia.
Well, when I read the report that that justified the finding that I had violated Columbia's rules, it was shocking. They didn't interview anybody other than the complainants, who held this personal view that what I had said offended them. But that's not the standard of whether I've discriminated. You have to show that it's both subjectively offensive and objectively so, that it would be to any reasonable person offensive. And they didn't speak to any other people in the community. And
This was the outside investigator.
yes, correct. And they also ruled that I had not been truthful when I said that there had been a pattern on our campus that I was aware of, and because students had told me of these sorts of attacks against pro-Palestinian protesters. And for that reason, they were going to find me that there was no justification for what I was saying. They didn't interview anybody else. They could have asked me who they might interview, who those former students were who had done it. And it was quite clear to me that the thing was cooked from the very beginning, that the university needed to produce some person who had been found guilty of violating these rules so they could go back to Congress and say, yes, we're taking this seriously. And there was a appeals process that we went through, but I had absolutely no expectation that this would turn out any differently with that appeals process. And the harassment that I had experienced continued. And the semester was about to begin. I couldn't get the provost or my own dean to speak to me to talk about how to be protected going into this new semester. And I realized there's no way I could safely go into the classroom, and I wanted to negotiate with them that we could advance my retirement from what was supposed to be 2 or 3 years from now to now, because I just couldn't see being in the building, being on campus, and being in the classroom as a good experience for me and a safe one. And finally, I got them to respond a week before school was supposed to start. And they said, sure, we'll let you retire, but you have to sacrifice all of the retirement benefits, basically, that you've negotiated. And that to me didn't count as a retirement. That counted to me as a kind of constructive discharge. Like, we're gonna punish you through your retirement, even though the appeal has not yet been decided in your case, and impose the sanction that we might have otherwise imposed on you through your so-called retirement. And So that's what pushed me to make the decision that I did, that I would take what is a terrible deal, because I had no other choice. And I had teaching looming in the next week, and I didn't have any sense that it would be a safe experience for me.
Can you just talk, you mentioned a little bit at the beginning of our conversation, but can you just talk a little bit more about the kinds of incidents that you experienced in and out of the classroom that made you feel like it wasn't safe to teach at Columbia Law School anymore?
Well, I've had colleagues who have, if you know the campus, the Columbia campus, there's the subway at 116th Street. I walk across the entire campus, getting out of the subway and then over to Amsterdam and into the law school building. And I have had, on a couple of occasions, colleagues who I thought were friends, follow me across the campus, yelling terrible things at me. And I would say to them, that's not true, and let's not do this in front of the students in any event. And one of them followed me the entire way across the campus into the building and up the elevator, in front of students, accusing me of being a Hamas supporter, which of course I am not. And accusing me of supporting the horrible violence of October 7th, which of course I do not. And I've had, as I've said before, there are these people who pose as students in my classrooms, in my office, people recording me without my consent and knowledge. I've had death threats at home. People know where I live. And I just did not see that there was a way that the university was going to protect me from my colleagues and from these people who are plants, who are part of the Columbia University community.
Did you have specific requests of the kind of protection that you were seeking, that you asked them for?
Well, when I've had faculty members yell these horrible things at
Mm,
me, I've asked the HR department, is this something that violates a rule? And they
mm,
said, no,
mhm,
there
mhm,
actually is nothing we can do about that.
mhm, mhm. I'm just curious, did you ever have a conversation with the two faculty who filed this complaint, where you had an opportunity to try to explain to them why you feel like they had misunderstood what you were saying?
I was advised by my attorney not to do so for fear that they would file more retaliation claims against me. But
Mhm,
one of them, who is Israeli, on October, I think 9th, I wrote him and the other Israeli members of the Columbia Law faculty individual notes saying, I hope you're okay. I hope your family's okay. Must be an extremely awful time. And some of them I never heard back from, but these are people who I thought I had cordial relationships with and who I actually felt very badly for what they and their families must have been going through. It's excruciating. I have always thought of myself as somebody who's enormously cordial.
mhm, mhm,
I take the professionalism on the job seriously. I think for the most part, Columbia faculty, up until these events starting on October 7th, were very cordial with one another, even where we disagreed about all manner of things. And that shifted after October 7th.
mhm, mhm.
Um,
Did where are you aware of other faculty who have had experiences of the kind that you're talking about, where
yes.
they felt
Been
um
screamed at on the street by other colleagues, one of whom is the same person who filed this complaint against me.
uh,
um, uh, that that uh, that they too have worried about their own safety going in the building,
uh, uh,
for the ways in which we could not, or some people could not keep civil about our disagreements.
uh,
And Peter, I just want to
yeah.
underscore one thing. I was not involved in protests on campus. I
Mhm,
was involved in working with students who were disciplined for protests on campus.
mhm, mhm,
I thought early on, my lane is being the lawyer or being the advisor for the students.
mhm,
And it was merely even showing up to defend the students through the disciplinary process that engendered this intense response from several of my colleagues and from other people, and made me a target. And that's part of what has shocked me so much and makes it feel so much like a McCarthyite kind of response to this very moment, is that even the advocates and the lawyers who were working with the people who were saying things that make people uncomfortable are as much a target as the people who are actually out there protesting.
Right, right. As you know, there's a perception in some quarters that that there have been Jewish students at Columbia who have, in a way, also felt not safe on the campus. You mentioned that there were outside folks, but do you? It's one of the fascinating things about this whole thing, to listen to it, is that in a sense we have these kind of dueling narratives of unsafety in a way, and I'm curious what you make of that perception, which is not a perception of, a fairly significant number of people, that actually they felt unsafe as supporters of Israel on Columbia's campus.
Well, first, let's just remember that there are Jewish students and faculty protesting on all the sides of this
Sure,
issue,
sure,
right?
of
So
course,
it's not
of
like it's
course.
all the Jewish students on
No, no,
one side
no. It's
defending
a
Israel.
certain group. Yeah.
Yes, and there are lots of Jewish students, a lot of Jewish students who are protesting in favor of Palestinian rights and dignity. But I think it's important to make a distinction between feeling uncomfortable
Mm-hmm.
with things that are being said and
Mm-hmm.
political positions that are being taken,
Mm-hmm.
and being actually unsafe.
Mm-hmm.
And what I know we have seen is a slippage between discomfort
Mm-hmm.
and the articulation of a lack of safety. And by and large, the students that supported
Mm-hmm.
the Israeli government's actions did not protest in the same ways that the students who were defending the rights of Palestinians did. So you didn't see the same kind of symmetry of protest or engagement on our campus. So the pro-Israeli students were watching a campus that was predominantly critical of what the Israeli government was doing,
Right.
and they were uncomfortable with that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure many of them felt unpopular
Mm-hmm.
or kind of marginalized for their views.
Mm-hmm.
That is not the same thing as not being safe.
Mm-hmm.
It is not the same thing as being discriminated against.
Mm-hmm.
And what is enormously disappointing is that we didn't have strong university leadership stepping in and saying, okay, it's foreseeable that this would be uncomfortable for some of you.
Mm-hmm.
Let's figure out how we can come together as a community to talk about a hard thing. This is what we know how to do as educators, is talk about hard things in complicated ways. Instead, what we saw is a university that basically took sides and adopted the view of those who were uncomfortable and the narrative of those who were uncomfortable, to say that anything that makes me uncomfortable is actually biased against me. And part of where this problem derives from is where Columbia's not the only university, but it's certainly a great example of our trustees are not people who are deeply committed to the academic project. They are hedge fund managers, they are corporate lawyers, they are work for arms manufacturers. They're people who are wealthy. They could be on the Pepsi board or on General Motors board or Columbia's board. They're just boards that they're on, and they don't actually appreciate the unique kind of mission that we have at a university. And as a result, they didn't understand that in a moment of conflict like this, there's a special way that we at a university could hold that conversation that might bring us back, at least, and maybe not together in the same point, but that we could tolerate one another. And then we had a new president who was weak, who was actually not all that familiar with American academic culture, and herself incapable of really exercising the kind of gravitas that we needed to hold our community together. And then the last thing I'll say, and this is particular to Columbia, is that the university is basically now run by the general counsel's office, right?
By the attorney.
by the general counsel for the university. The president, the office of the presidency has really been weakened and is more of a functionary who performs certain things that the trustees or the general counsel expect her to do. And that's been an unfortunate turn for all sorts of reasons, including what has happened after October 7th, is that the office itself doesn't carry the kind of weight that it used to, and that power has shifted to the general counsel's office, who was in alignment with what the right-wing Republicans in Congress were calling for. She carries an ideological brief at Columbia and is implementing it through the Office of the General Counsel with the support of several members of the Board of Trustees. And the president simply doesn't have enough weight to counteract that or power to counteract that anymore. And that, I think, is a tragedy. And my worry at the beginning of this whole period is that this is going to break Columbia University, and it's becoming close to doing so.
What do you mean? What do you mean by break?
That we will just become yet another business and not the real, I joined this faculty. I went to college on this campus because I thought it was so special. The faculty is amazing. The student body was incredible, and it's in the city of New York. Every interesting person comes through New York at some point. And as an undergraduate, I was able to be exposed to that. And then I had professors like Edward Said and all sorts of amazing professors that rendered Columbia a particularly special place and was the site for all sorts of social contestation, whether it was around the Vietnam War, it was around racism, it was around feminism, it was around anything. It was happening at Columbia, and Columbia was able to hold it. I was actually proud that it was a place that could hold that kind of both controversy, protest, and tolerance for one another. It isn't anymore. I often joke that really what Columbia is a real estate holding enterprise that has a side hustle of teaching classes. That's what it feels like. It's a corporation that protects its endowment only, and no longer protects its academic mission.
Do you think that distinguishes Columbia from other large, well-funded universities, Harvard or Yale or
No, I think they all suffer from the same kind of problem, the corporatization of the university. But I think Columbia's degradation as a result of that transition in its leadership and values is more apparent than on almost any other campus right now.
And I'm curious, you talked about trustees. I'm curious how much you think this pressure is a function of donors to the university and how much it's a function of fear from the federal government. I mean, the federal government potentially has almost kind of nuclear style options vis-a-vis universities, right? If they were to cut off federal funding. So I'm wondering how you weigh these competing pressures that you think a university like Columbia faces.
Oh, I think these things are related. The business model of the university has moved in the direction of subsidizing the kinds of fields of study and teaching that receive federal grants. Now, why is that attractive? Because the university takes a 50% cut of federal grants. Private grants, like from the Ford Foundation or Mellon or Guggenheim, those kinds of places, they take 10%. Right? The university doesn't really gain significant revenue from private foundations, but they do from federal grants. And this is, as the humanities have been, we've invested less and less in the humanities and expanded more and more in the sciences and in medicine. The university's business model has accommodated or actually motivated that because the university gets so much income from those federal grants. This week, the faculty in the humanities, in philosophy, in history, in the classics, in the arts, were told that they were going to have a 65% cut in the number of PhD student enrollments they were allowed to have this coming year. That is the future of the academy. But it's the future of teaching because it's PhD students who do a lot of the teaching on campuses. They're not getting the similar cuts in the sciences. And so the university's business model which is to rely, I think, too much on these federal grants,
Mhm.
both impacts what we can do on campus, but also impacts the outside forces that can exercise power based on the fact that we're so dependent on those public grants. So the university didn't have to evolve in this direction where it became over-dependent on federal funding, but it did.
Mhm.
And it certainly shapes the kind of funding, the kind of research and teaching we can do, because it's only that research and teaching that the federal government will fund. So the sorts of things I do will never get federal grants.
Uh-huh.
And even some of my more creative and interesting colleagues in the sciences
Mhm.
will never get a federal grant for the kinds of work that they're doing.
Right. Do you see any concern that the restrictions that have been put into place when it comes to speech around criticism of Israel may also be affecting people's ability to protest when it comes to other subjects?
Oh, absolutely. The spillover of what's happened in the last year and a half has terrified people. People are afraid of being fired. I
Mhm.
mean, I was constructively discharged. I've left Columbia because of the hostile environment there, but there are a number of other people who were untenured or more vulnerable who were just straight out fired.
Mhm.
And I mean, I know for a fact that that has chilled the speech of everyone across the campus. We haven't had protests.
Mhm.
All
Mhm.
fall, we didn't really have many protests because the
Mhm.
students are terrified they're not going to graduate,
Mhm.
or they're going to not be able to get apply to graduate school and get their transcripts, or will have some other mark on their record.
Mhm.
And the faculty are afraid of being fired.
Mhm.
So it doesn't matter whether it's on this subject or whatever comes next. And this is always why I worried
Mhm.
that how they're treating pro-Palestinian protesters today
Mhm.
opens the door for how they will treat what comes next.
Mhm.
And with this new government that's inaugurated today, what will it be? Pro-trans speech, being critical of climate change or
Mhm.
energy policy, reproductive rights?
Mhm.
There's a whole lot of nominees, I think, for things that will become next, that is kind of foreseeable at this point, and that we're just not seeing people speaking as freely on our campuses as we used to.
Yeah. Um, Katherine, thank you for spending so much time going through talking about what is obviously a really personally painful and extremely difficult and disturbing set of events. I really appreciate you doing this.
Well, Peter, it's good to talk to you, and I want to thank you for the ways you cover these issues so thoughtfully and carefully.
Thank you. And thanks to our audience for listening or watching. And finally, as always, I want to remind you to subscribe to the Occupied Thoughts podcast. You can do so on iTunes, SoundCloud, or Spotify. That way you won't miss any of the great content we're posting every week. You can also find the podcast and a video of the podcast on our website at fmep.org. And with that, we will end this. I'm Peter Beinart, signing off until the next episode of Occupied Thoughts.